The next day, the funeral. The morning was gloomy, even the sun didn't dare to fully emerge from behind the clouds. Thomas woke up early, his head felt heavy, as if after a long sleep, even though he had hardly slept at all. The room seemed too big. Even the sounds of the street seemed muffled, as if the whole world had become thicker, heavier. Martha was in the other room. Thomas smelled the iron. She was preparing clothes for the funeral. Her movements were precise, mechanical, like a clockwork. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just existed in silence. She left a black suit on her son's bed, a little too big. A white shirt. Dark shoes. It all looked as if they were preparing for a performance. Only the performance was a funeral. "Can you get dressed yourself?" she asked in an even voice. "Yes," he replied and looked away. When they went outside, the house looked even emptier. It was as if there was no longer any history inside. The cemetery was on a hill, not far from the old church. Several relatives, neighbors, and George's friends from the workshop had gathered there. No one said anything unnecessary. Everyone was dressed in dark clothes. The silence was broken only by footsteps on the gravel. Thomas stayed close to his mother. His hand kept touching his pocket. There was a wooden boat there. The only thing that still reminded him of his father, not as a memory, but as a person. When the coffin was lowered into the ground, Thomas couldn't take it anymore and stepped forward. No one stopped him. He approached the edge of the pit, took the boat out of his pocket, looked at it, and whispered, "Keep going, Captain." And he dropped it into the hole. For the first time in days, Martha flinched. A single, barely audible sob, and then silence again. In the background, one of the neighbors, Mrs. Norton, wiped her eyes. She whispered to her husband, "I can't imagine how Martha will manage on her own. And the boy is so fragile." The people around did not disperse immediately. Someone brought flowers, someone silently touched Martha on the shoulder, someone leaned over to Thomas and said something vague, words like, "Hang in there, he's in a better place now." But none of them sounded true to a child who had lost her center of gravity. After the funeral, everyone left slowly. Martha refused the memorial dinner. She and Thomas walked home. The evening was cold. At home, Thomas took off his suit, hung it neatly on the back of a chair, and sat down on the floor in his room. He didn't want to eat. He didn't want to talk. He just needed to be. Martha stood in the kitchen and looked out the window. In her hand was a cup of coffee she hadn't drunk. Her lips trembled slightly, and her gaze was empty. She finally allowed herself to fall into a chair and whispered, "George, how are we going to live now?" The house grew quiet. But not peaceful. That night, Thomas fell asleep without undressing. And his sleep was empty. For the first time, he had no dreams about his father. Only darkness. Only silence. Supporting the family after the funeral. The next morning, there was a knock at the door. At first it was gentle, then more insistent. Martha opened the door to find Mrs. Norton standing on the doorstep with a large basket in her hands. "Here's some pie. And apple jam, just like George liked," she said quietly. "Can I help you with anything? Sit with Thomas, or cook something?" Martha nodded. There was no gratitude or refusal in her eyes, only fatigue. A few minutes later, another neighbor, Mrs. Ellis, arrived with cookies. Then George's cousin Jill arrived with her 2 children, and without asking, she immediately began washing the kitchen floor. Thomas sat on the sofa in the living room. There was a plate of pie on the table in front of him, but he didn't touch it. He was silent. Everything around him seemed to be underwater, voices muffled, faces distorted, gestures slowed down. "Thomas," Jill leaned toward him, "if you want to talk about him." "I don't want to," he interrupted calmly but firmly. "People started coming all day long. Some brought food, others just hugged Martha or left cards with words of sympathy. A man from the auto repair shop left a small box containing a set of old tools, in memory of George, if the boy ever wants to learn. "He's not coming back?" Thomas asked Martha quietly when they were alone. "No, dear." Her voice broke mid-sentence. "Then why all these things? The food? The flowers? They won't bring him back. They're not for him. They're for us," she whispered, "so we don't fall apart." Thomas didn't answer. He just stared at the boat sitting on the shelf. Then he stood up, walked over, picked it up, and held it tightly to his chest. And the whole house was filled with silence, no longer empty, but saturated with the presence of those who knew how to be silent together. The first week after the funeral passed in silence. The days seemed to drag on, the clock ticked more slowly, and the world outside the window was constantly gray, as if the weather itself sympathized. Martha woke up early, sometimes before dawn. She made tea, washed the dishes silently, ironed Thomas's school uniform, even though he wasn't attending school yet. She clung to her daily routine as if it were the last structure she had left. The neighbors came every day. Mrs. Ellis brought hot food in containers. Mr. Glenn from across the street helped repair the barn door. Some brought firewood, some brought old blankets, some brought books for Thomas. Everyone came with the same look, sad, but without excessive words. They didn't ask questions. They were just there. And that presence, quiet, delicate, was the best comfort imaginable. For several days, Thomas hardly spoke. He sat either on the windowsill or in an old armchair, hugging a wooden boat. Only once, when Mrs. Norton brought a photograph of George from the workshop, did he ask, "Is he smiling there?" "Yes, Thomas." Very sincerely. "Then can I keep this photo with me?" From then on, the photo stood on his bedside table. Martha noticed that her son was waking up later. He often made himself toast or poured milk. She watched him from the kitchen table, not daring to say anything unnecessary. One thought kept running through her head: how could she teach her child to live on when she herself could barely breathe? On Friday, the postman came and delivered an envelope marked, "To the Grayson family." Inside was a card from her father's former colleague. George wasn't just a good worker, he was the heart and soul of the workshop. We all feel his loss. If you need anything, just let us know. Thomas stared at the letter for a long time. Then he whispered, "If he was the heart and soul, why was he replaced so quickly?" Martha clenched her fists but said nothing. She knew that the first questions were the most painful. And there were no answers. Sunday was the first night when the house felt a little warmer. Jill came with the children, brought soup, and played an old jazz record that George used to love. Everyone sat in silence, but the music played, and Thomas even smiled for a moment. "He played that in the kitchen on Saturday morning," he whispered. "Yes. Always when he was washing the dishes," Martha replied. "And he always sang along out of tune." The room became brighter. Not for long. But it was enough. So the first week passed, between silence and sympathy, between difficult mornings and memories that now lived in small things: a cup left on the shelf, a hook in the hallway where a jacket no longer hung, music that echoed through the absence. And in this new reality, Thomas was beginning to grow up, not in years, but in pain. The last rays of sunlight sluggishly slid across the living room floor, where Thomas sat wrapped in his father's old blanket. In his hands was a wooden boat. He ran his finger over the carved name, Tomas. The mast swayed slightly, as if searching for wind in the room, where everything was now silent. Meanwhile, Martha sat in the kitchen, finishing her third cup of tea of the evening, which had long since grown cold. On the table lay a to-do list: call the school, fill out the paperwork, bank. She didn't read it, she just ran her pen over the lines, like the seams of her life, which creaked with every breath. Towards evening, Jill visited again, bringing warm buns. After a few words about the weather and how everyone on the street was sad, she hugged Martha. She didn't resist, she just stared at the wall. The hug no longer warmed her, but at least it didn't cut through the air. When it got dark outside and only the two of them were left in the house, Martha turned off the light in the kitchen, leaving only the night light in the living room on. Thomas was already in bed. He didn't ask for a bedtime story, didn't ask anything, he just stared at the ceiling. "Are you asleep?" Martha asked quietly, crouching down next to him. "What if I fall asleep, will he come in my dreams?" Martha sighed. She hugged him and whispered, "If he comes in your dreams, it will be good. Because it means he's somewhere nearby." Thomas closed his eyes. A few minutes later, all that remained in the room was the shadow of the curtain swaying, the silence of the old house, and his first sleep without his father. Thus ended the third day, the day when memory became the only thing that still spoke to them both. The day when silence began to sound louder than words.